Okay, hello everyone. Today I am broadcasting from the City of Life, the City of Light. I'm all the way from Paris, and I'm speaking to Dave Nicholls. Dave Nicholls, I believe is his surname. He's the chairperson of Nexa. Dave, welcome.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's
So
fascinating to be on here. Yeah,
it's interesting that we have this conversation at distance. You know, I'm a South African in Paris speaking to a Brit running South Africa's nuclear.
well, I'm not running South Africa's nuclear. I just be careful. I was Eskom's chief nuclear officer up until when I retired from Eskom in end of 2018. 2019. And I was then appointed to be the chairman of Nexa after I retired. So I was, and chairman's a non-executive in theory. That's the theory of life. And most of the nuclear industry is, I suppose, split between Eskom running the Koeberg nuclear power station, which was what I was doing in Eskom, and Nexa, which is the national laboratory basically, and runs a research reactor and very heavily involved in radioisotope production and things.
Right. So I want to get from you the brief outline of South Africa's nuclear industry. You know, what do we have? What don't we have? Because we obviously know we've got Koeberg. Some people know a little bit about Pelindaba, but we don't really know what it does. And then there's Safari, and relating 2 and 2 and 3 is very difficult. And then Nexa, you know, how does it all fit in?
Okay, well, in South Africa, and I may be wrong in this, but there were 4 state-owned nuclear activities. I'll start with the easy one first. There's a nuclear regulator run by Dr. Toyebeka, who is accountable for the regulation of all the nuclear activities. Very classical nuclear regulator in the sense of the French or the American regulators. That's the easy one. The second one is you've got Nexa, and Nexa is a nuclear, and that's actually very funny. Nexa is actually legally the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation. So why is it called Nexa? And the answer is they'd almost passed the Act of Parliament to create it until somebody realized that SANEC was an existing acronym in the country. So we are Nexa, but we are South African Nuclear Energy Corporation. Does that make sense?
African Nuclear Energy Corporation. Okay. And what is the responsibility of Nexa then?
And Nexa has is basically the nuclear research center. So there's about several things I'll go through. It's the nuclear research center, and it's accountable for nuclear fuel activities as far as there are in the country. So at one point, Nexa was actually had enrichment plants and fabrication plants. That's all been shut down. So, and clearly at one point, some of the enrichment processes were going on to very high levels, which was interesting to the world. So that's one aspect of the company. And that aspect is largely shut down, and largely what Nexa is doing now is decommissioning that. So a large part of Nexa's core business, in a sense, is actually to decommission and decontaminate the existing plant, or the old plant. We also run Safari, which is a research reactor. It's 55 years old now or something. It is achieving the best availabilities in the world. It's over 320 days a year on load, basically doing, and it's virtually all it's doing is medical isotope production, Moly-99 and other such things. And in fact, we're about 20% of the world's medical radiopharmaceuticals come from South Africa.
Oh, that's interesting.
That runs on, there's a company, a subsidiary called NTP, which stands for Nuclear Technology Products, which is the isotope production company, which runs the hot cells that actually basically extract the moly and things from the target plates that are radiated in Safari. The other side, interesting enough, is a company called Pelchem, which is in the fluorochemical business, because clearly when you were doing enrichment programs, there was a conversion plant on site, and there was a technology to do fluorochemicals work. And it's quite a lucrative business to be in it, but the only plant of its type in south of the equator. and we actually we make fluorochemicals for domestic and export work. And that's very interesting but that's a spin-off of the conversion plant process. We need to keep it going because it's part of the requirement to keep ourselves there. So, and we do research into nuclear activities generally, but most of the research is done to improve the commercial work of those two subsidiaries. We also have an internal organization called Pelindaba Enterprises, which has got an ASME 3 N stamp. So thirdly, we are qualified to, pardon my dogs, we are qualified to design and manufacture. We have a manufacturing shop that is ASME 3 qualified, and we can design and manufacture ASME 3 components. Right, so that's Nexa.
Yeah.
And Nexa has essentially all the, in a sense, probably its biggest single thing is the residue from the programs of the past. At one point, the Nexa site had 8,000 people on site, and it built everything. I mean, everything it had there, it built itself. Very impressive engineering. Now we're much smaller. We're about 1,500 all told.
So do we get the sense then that nuclear has been reduced, that it's had its heyday in South Africa?
I'll come back to that in a second. You asked that question, I'll come back to it because there's a bit of a background to all this. The next one clearly is Eskom. Eskom runs the Koeberg nuclear power station. It's a classical 2-unit plant. And it runs as a separate essentially a separate organization inside Eskom. And it's got about 1,700 people, and it does all the nuclear activities for Eskom. So it's a self-contained operating unit, and essentially runs essentially as a separate division of the company. If it was being paid for the price of power in the country, it'd be highly profitable, very highly profitable. It clearly runs in a cost-plus environment or a cost recovery environment inside the Eskom system as a state utility. But if it was a private company, it would be pretty profitable. And then lastly, we've got the National Radioactive Waste Disposal Institute, which is essentially spun out of Nexa a couple of years ago, and essentially is accountable for the radioactive waste management in the country and runs our intermediate low-level waste repository up at Valputs.
That's in the Karoo.
It's on the edge of the Karoo. Yes, it's interesting in that I worked out recently. I think it's something like 100 plus times bigger than the US repository physically. It is an enormous piece. I mean, there's nothing up there. If you know South Africa, you know that in the Karoo there's a big open space called no one lives there. And we have like 20 people who live within 20 kilometers of it. It really is something. And we set up the intermediate low-level waste repository there before Koeberg started up. We have done some boreholes there which show that the rock is particularly stable, and we essentially could easily be talking about the final repository in the same place. But it is very large indeed. It's like 100 square kilometers. It's something quite insane in terms of size.
Why is it that big? It sounds like they overcalculated or they overestimated.
No. I think it was more the question that if you want to buy a farm up there, I mean, someone buys a farm. A farm in that part can be sort of 10,000 hectares easily.
And useless at the same time. It's extraordinary.
I mean, you can't grow anything on it. I mean, repositories have to have a golden rule, which is they must have no economic value. So nobody in 1,000 years' time tries to dig a hole in the ground to find. So you don't put a repository in the middle of a gold mine unless you're somewhat weird, or any other useful mine. Now, there is nothing useful we know of in the Karoo. Now, please don't quote me on that one. I'm sure a Karoo farmer will confuse me.
I have family that's from the Karoo, so don't.
You understand? 100K. It's 100K north of Springbok, I think. It really is.
Yeah, it's the middle of nowhere. I just know the distance from Kimberley to Port Nolloth is about 1,000 kilometers, and between there's absolutely nothing.
I just think people don't, outside South Africa, the realization, I mean, I actually see South Africa as being a series of islands.
Yeah. And
in between there was a large open space with almost nothing in it. So, you take out Joburg and Cape Town and Durban and maybe Port Elizabeth and you've got a series of islands in the country, and in between them there's a big space.
Well, there's two reasons for that. I mean, one is that when you take the map of the world and you fold it on a flat piece of paper, you make the poles look bigger than the equator. And we are closer to the equator than the poles, so we get screwed by the flat map, essentially. Yeah. The other thing is just, I think geography is not taught that well. It's just basic thing like that. Because I see it even with our leaders. We had Ramaphosa. I don't want to insult the president, but Ramaphosa recently announced a smart city. Now, smart cities means high densification. I think to myself, we've got all the space. What are you talking about?
I'm not going to go down that little line.
Yeah, I don't want to, but it's just a point to make that people don't think geographically sometimes how big and how empty it is.
You're in Paris, and you realize that Coburg is 1,400 kilometers from the next power station.
Right.
And there is no other nuclear station on Earth that is that far away from the next baseload power station.
That's the distance from London to Rome, basically.
Yeah, it's London. I think it's Brussels to Gibraltar as well. But it's nobody would. I remember when I lived in the UK, and there was concerns that there were no power stations in the West Country. That it was 200 miles or something from Land's End to the next power station. That was unacceptable. To us, the idea, and of course, when Coburg's got both machines down, which is very, very rare, but has happened a couple of times, then we can support Cape Town from Johannesburg. It is a different world, which is one of the issues that used to occupy our mind in terms of power supplies to the power station. And you asked about the industry. Okay, so that's the industry as it stands. Pretty straightforward. Important things here on the industry, which I think that's worth putting in mind, is that we've also got a series of local nuclear qualified companies that do work largely for Coburg. And they're not very big, and they tend to be specialized, and they do more work than just Coburg, but they've been a couple of companies which have built up over the years support us. Clearly, the problem you've got is things like outage support. You've got an outage every 9 months, 18-month cycles, 2 units. So therefore, if you're running a company whose job is to provide services in outages, then what do you do for the rest of the year?
Yeah.
And so in fact, one of the companies is doing quite a lot of work outside South Africa, supporting nuclear companies elsewhere, nuclear projects elsewhere. I think what's important to understand, the other couple of things that I would put what's been going on, and this is where it gets quite interesting, is that South Africa has been trying to build more nuclear plant for an awful long time.
Yeah. And
trying in the sense of the politics gets in the way. And the priorities of the country. I'm the first new build nuclear project I was involved with about 1989, when there was a plan to build another unit, what's called the bridging program. We recognized there was going to be a pause in building plant because of the overcapacity in the Eskom grid, and should we build another nuclear unit to keep the skill set going? Now that was.
So wait, I just want to understand. In 1989, you said there was overcapacity in the country.
Oh, in terms of power, yes. Massively so.
We wish we had that problem right now.
Right. Well. Now that's a different discussion. Which I've done a few lectures. I will, if you ever ask me, I will happily send you a link to a YouTube video I did once on all this issue. But essentially, don't forget, Eskom from late 70s to the early 80s was growing at 10% per year demand growth rate.
Yeah.
We were short of power. You wanted to build heavy industry in those days, and there was a lot of mining energy. You would have to go to Eskom and say, when can I get my 200 megawatts? And they would say, not for 4 years.
That's in the 80s now, just to get it on my.
No, this is the late 70s, early 80s.
Right.
Now, by the time I joined Eskom in 84, we were over that hump. In 82, I know because in 82, that really was, we need more power today. It was a crisis. Although there was lots of power stations in construction. In 84, we had as much plant on order and in construction as we had in service. We were commissioning 2,000 megawatts a year of new coal-fired power stations. It really was an amazing era of construction.
Is there a particular reason why it seems to be run it on a very, for lack of a better word, strange supply chain, that it's almost on demand that we try and get power stations, or?
No, that's a discussion in its own right. I'll get back to the nuclear bit in discussion, but let's go. To answer that question, what really happened in South Africa is that Eskom, when I joined 85, had been, since 1923, run by engineers. And it was extreme. Let me explain. We had what's called the management board, which is presently called the executive committee, same thing. And when I joined, there were about 10 people on the executive committee. all of them were engineers except the legal manager and the finance manager. Even the human resources manager was an engineer.
That sounds good. As an engineer, I think it sounds good.
Yeah, no, it was great. And you were building, and they would literally be able to discuss detailed engineering issues at the executive committee. That was 84, 85. We then went through a process of saying, you've overbuilt plant because you're too conservative, you engineers. And therefore, what was said was, we must make you more commercial. Now, by 2000, there was not a single engineer on the Eskom executive committee.
So we overshoot with the mindset.
And basically, we built so much plant. So the problem we had, and what caused the problem in South Africa now, and I'll try and get back to the nuclear industry in a second, is that Eskom overbuilt because you're building a 14-year lead time for stations back in the 70s and the 80s. From the day you decide to go for a station and you start and you contract for the coal field, I'm at coal station now, until the day when the last of the 6-pack units is on service, it's not about 14 years. So think of a compound growth rate of 10% a year you're building against, which disappeared. It fell to about 3%. Now, from 82 to 2007, South Africa averaged about 3.4% year-on-year compound growth in demand. Pretty consistent. I mean, each year was different, but if you draw a graph and you were doing your MBA and you said that's time-based, that you get good marks for it. So Eskom from 85, 87 onwards was trying to sweat the assets, slow things down. We got all the stations into construction. We mothballed older power stations. We scrapped some of the really old stations. We deferred the construction of new ones. There was a really funny discussion. Eskom's contracting had no cancellation clauses in those days. So you couldn't cancel the power station without paying all the penalties, which was quite interesting. But Eskom knew this was going to run out. This excess capacity was going to run out. And by about the early mid-1990s, people were talking about, if this growth goes on, then we're going to need more plant by about 2007. Right? This is quite interesting because you're now looking sort of 10, 14 years in the future. However, there was a belief, and I now am going to use my only racist comment if I can for this discussion, but please understand where it comes from, was that I have a suspicion that a lot of the old guard, who at that point were entirely old white gentlemen, I mean, not old as in old, but, old, couldn't believe we'd go on growing under the new regime. They were looking at the Zimbabwean situation. So when somebody said, I must now invest my time and career in getting more power stations ready for 25 years into the dispensation, it was like, okay, maybe not. Yeah. The analysts were saying, no, we got to, and then you had the other thing, we'd moved to a financially driven organization. And so in the financially driven organization, clearly power stations have a classic situation that when you build a power station, you lose money in the first couple of years if you look at accounting.
Yeah, you have to pay back the capex basically.
Yeah, and all that kind of stuff. And then you get to middle age and the station's settled down for about 30 years, it runs and it pumps money out for you. Yeah. And then you get to the end of its life and it gets unreliable and it's like running an old motor car, you end up with more and more costs until eventually scrap it or buy a new one. So that's where we are. We were sitting with all our stations in midlife.
This was now, just to get the timeline set, in the mid-2008.
This is about let's say middle-late 90s.
Okay, so sorry, mid-90s, yeah.
Right. Okay.
So this was Mandela basically was still president, or Mbeki was president.
Yes, he was still president. But, and by the way, Mbeki was really running the command. Mandela was president, but he was really a figurehead in many ways. Mbeki was president for 15 years. That's how I see it. Maybe I'm just.
Yeah, no, you're right. He was de facto prime minister.
Yeah, prime minister became president, and. What happened then was that you got the finance men saying, we can't make money from a new power station, or not in any time frame that we think is reasonable. You had the government being persuaded by the free marketeers and the IPP type lobbyists saying that we should be moving away from a centralized state utility towards private sector. Okay. And you had, in the background, you had the engineers and guys saying, we need a power station by 2007. Could we start construction in about 1997? But the finance men, when the government came to Eskom and said, we don't want you to build, we want the free market to build, whatever that means, I'm not sure. I have a whole debate in its own right. Yeah. the finance guys in Eskom sort of said, well, there's a problem, but hey, we're pretty happy. It means we haven't got to spend billions of rand buying a new power station. We'll leave it to somebody else. And what then happened was really funny. So the growth wasn't exactly as advertised. It was a perfect curve. And in about 2004, a new minister came in, Alec Irwin came as Minister of Public Enterprises. And he read the 98 energy policy, which had said, we're going to run out of power in 2007, but the free market will build power stations to fill the hole in. And he went to Eskom and said, does this 2007 date still stand? And Eskom said, yeah, we're going to run out of power in 2007. That's what our curves tell us. Yeah. And then they said, okay, well, are you building power stations to? No, we're not. We've been told not to. And Eskom then was suddenly told, oh, good grief, go build power stations. Now, let's just get that in context. We had demobilized every aspect of Eskom that was aimed at building power stations.
So you got rid of your institutional knowledge, essentially.
Well, there was no engineering group in the company. The engineering was devolved down to the power stations, so the engineers were aiming at keeping their station running. There was no central engineering organization. There was no engineering manager in the company. There was we dismantled the planning system, which we called ICEP, in about 2000 on the basis that, why are we doing this? We've been told we're not the planners. You know, the thing we've been running since 1923 of how do you build power stations to meet the national need was closed down. There was a request, I think it was in 2000, to spend 6 million rand, which is peanuts, to actually do a bill of materials of a 6-pack coal station. In other words, can we get a modern analysis of what it will cost to build a 6-pack coal station? And the 6 million rand in real terms is not a vast amount. And it was turned down because, excuse me, there's no need to do this.
Yeah.
And you could argue that the PBMR project that I was running through the 90s and to the early 2000s was closed down because if you're not going to build any new plant, why are you doing a development job on a new nuclear power station?
But it sounds like a little bit of short-sightedness.
A little bit?
Not a little bit, but it's not just short-sightedness. It's I mean, there was a tactic, I think Thatcher and Reagan were accused of this, where they essentially, you first sabotage the state-run companies, and then you complain that it's inefficient afterwards, so you can get private guys running. And it seemed to be a combination of that thinking going with incompetence and short-sightedness.
I wouldn't say that because the policy came in 98, and I don't believe, I believe it was naive. I believe it was like the Californian policy, which caused the crisis in 2000. Again, I'd almost argue the 98 Eskom energy, the energy policy of 98 was almost in conceptual going to the US system of how you do power, and that collapsed in the US in the Enron-driven saga of 2000 with the crisis in California. But I think that, so I don't think it was a mischievous, I think it was just a belief system, because I think I was thinking something else. I'll just put a different thought to you a second. Mm-hmm. In 1989, the USSR collapsed.
Yeah.
And the USSR collapsed primarily economically. I mean, we can argue about the military discussions and Star Wars and everything else, but essentially it was economics. And that was because pure central planning does not work in an economy.
Correct.
And the first world and the Western world said, you see, the free market is king. We should close down all state-owned enterprises. Now, I don't believe that. What I believe is a mixed economy, and the West had a mixed economy in '89.
But there's also a bit of dishonesty with that argument, because the way the industrial economy works in the Western world, and I'm not talking about the USSR. USSR was state-run economy.
Yeah.
Also fueled with the Russian Empire, which came the Soviet Union. There was lots of politics involved, and just blatant corruption as well. But basically, a state-run economy will lead to corruption and all the problems of the USSR. But if you look at the US economy today, it is a highly mixed economy. They claim to be free marketeers. What is Lockheed Martin? I mean, what is the US military? The US military is where the first development of the industrial economy happens. So essentially a technology runs through 10 tiers, as you would know. And when we get to about tier 5, that is when government gives it to the private sector and say, okay, make money out of it. And that's, pull it back into taxes. But for example, what is NASA was? What was the atomic bomb? All of these things were heavy state-run enterprises subsidizing technologies for generations. And that all of a sudden we forgot about it.
Oh no, I mean, I'm not going to go into hypocrisy here because the hypocrisy is you're knee deep in hypocrisy. I mean, I hold it. Anyway, getting back to the discussion. So there was a general belief in the intellectuals of the world that the world was going to free market, and in fact, that was one of the problems with Medupi and Cassili. So let's try. So in 2004, within 3 months of being put in his office, by I think it was October 2004, he got the cabinet to reverse the decision that Eskom should not build power stations. And Eskom then leapt both feet into building Medupi, what's now called Medupi and Cassili, with absolutely no real understanding. I had a friend of mine, well, an acquaintance, a guy called Tom Jacobs, who was the last Eskom employee who had been a project director on one of the big six packs in the part. I think it was Tutuka he ran. And what was hilarious about that was that he was asked, okay, he's about to retire. He was asked, what should we worry about in building these two new mega stations, which are after all only the same size as some of the 12 stations already built. So it wasn't actually that radical. And he said, well, you should worry about infrastructure, transport, roads, housing, sewage systems, waste disposal. They said, no. You don't understand. We've read the Harvard Business School studies. And in the new economy, that's the contractor's problem. Not ours. You must model ecology. We must ask you about whether supercritical steam is. And he said, look, no, that's not going to worry you. What's going to worry you is getting food to your workers and striking workers and getting the roads. Oh, no, the roads are fine. That's the job of Limpopo province to build better roads for us.
Limpopo province, where I'm from.
Yes, seriously. So the law says it's their problem to sort out. It's actually interesting because at the same time, the nuclear project was a little bit later, but was very overlapping. We'd already put money in our budget for the roads. We weren't quite sure how we were going to pay it, but we knew that there was no way in Hades that Eastern Cape was going to build us a nice, shiny new road. It wasn't going to happen. No. And we had to find the money for it somewhere, that kind of discussion. But there was that naivety going into it and the complete lack of any kind of experience. And we rushed into it, and it's actually sobering to realize that virtually all 12 machines were built in parallel, so that the lessons learned on the first machine being commissioned was too late to affect the design of the components for the 12th machine.
Right.
Are you with me?
Yeah.
And I'll give you another example. You may have noticed a bit of an oddity. Cassili is unit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Medupi goes 6, 4, 5, 3, 2, 1. And you may wonder, why do we build them in that order? Sounds odd. It doesn't make sense. Yeah. And everyone's given lots of. The real answer is exceptionally simple. We laid out the power station on the piece of ground that we just bought without having a chance to do the geotechnics of drilling holes in the ground to find out actually what the ground was like. So we laid out 6, and then we drilled holes. When we almost started building, we drilled holes in the ground and realized Unit 1, that the ground under Unit 1 was pretty ghastly. And we'd better start at Unit 6 first. That kind of discussion. I mean, it was that you went from we have not a single thought in the company of building a new power station to we have got bulldozers on 2 sites to build 2 of the biggest stations on Earth in like 24 months. And you think then you realize that there's problems coming out.
But there's just a naivety that comes with the idea that you can get rid of skills and hope you can push it back again. I was reading an article the other day about McKinsey and Company, how they manage. It's now a US projects they took, and they had the mindset of, we would take an airplane, for example, we would break it apart and put it back. So they apply the same mindset to a company. And they said, well, there's a lot of middle managers in many companies. We can just get rid of them, and we can sort of keep the rules the same, and the things will work exactly the same way. And then they wonder why the Boeing crashes. And it seems to me it's the same. It's the same thing.
It's the same, but the other one you get a lot of is that you come to your EPCM contractors, and this is one of the fundamentals in buying a new power station, and you give them the contract because they sound very impressive. They can make very good PowerPoint presentations, and what you realize is they've got a very good set of rules of how to run a project. They've got no people. They've got a small seed corn of people who are good. So when they try and be the EPCM contractor for Medupi or Cassili, for example, you send a few people from overseas in, then you recruit everyone else locally and you train them quickly to follow your processes. Yeah. And in fact, one of the funny things was Eskom said, we actually are unable to, Eskom hadn't got the resources or the money to build new power stations. It said, we must let the free market do it. assuming somewhere there was a box of money and a box of people to run the free market that wasn't ESCOM. What actually happened was that a large chunk of the engineering that they grabbed was all ex-ESCOM people. And the money was think about it, all the money you used to build the power station is borrowed against the future income of that power station. So there isn't a single box of money. If you give someone a power purchase agreement, then they will run with that, and they can go and raise money against it. So there's a whole part of it. But getting back to nuclear, because you confuse the nuclear. Yeah. So ESCOM, for whatever reason, I'm not going to get, ESCOM went big into what was called the PBMR, which I started and ran from essentially 93 when it really sort of first moved. And that was like 2% of my time. It was like a few papers. And I think I got 7,000 rand in the first year to study it and go forward. And that grew over the next 10 years to essentially end up being something like 900 people. And essentially probably one of the biggest design teams in the world. It was actually, and I'm still desperately proud of it because, for example, everyone gets these wonderful 3D CAD systems to actually design things and manufacture things, But normally you've drawn it on paper first and you try and link your different CAD to, well, in fact, we never had a paper drawing that was a controlled copy. Everything was on the CAD system. Every nut, bolt, and washer of the entire plant. It was a bigger model than Boeing's model for a 747. Oh, really? They had to expand the model we were using into Graph because it was physically too big for the model they had. And every few months, we'd shut the whole program down for a week. We'd load the entire model, come up with all the clashes, and then go back and fix all the clashes. But essentially, the rule was that if it was a printed document, it was not a controlled copy.
How far did the little bit get?
It was in the actual machine, which meant you could use all the features of, I want to use the machine to analyze my stress analysis. So on. That was all very doable as a thing. But so PBMR was going along. It hit a problem essentially, as I said, in ESCOM essentially, in my view, in 91, 92, it hit a big problem in ESCOM that ESCOM said, and it isn't obvious to me outside, but ESCOM said, we don't do this. We're not doing this thing. We are trying to go lean and mean and not do any expansion. So why are we getting involved in here? The government then got involved big time and was very supportive of it. And they funded it, but with no real customer and no utility drive behind it. It ran out of steam in 2010. But it was very much, and you look across the world now at a lot of the SMR projects, you'll find South Africans busy.
Do you think that we were maybe a little bit early with the SMRs? Because everyone is now talking about decarbonization, for example. I don't think that was in the mindset in the 90s and the 2000s.
I will answer that we were within we literally, if one or two people had different mindsets in 2001, 2002, it would have gone forward.
Right. And was it sophisticated enough to be built at the moment, or was it still design?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, no. I mean, we physically, I mean, I'll give an example. Mitsubishi, I remember Mitsubishi, when they came involved, they said, let's talk about this. And they were very wary of this thing. Japanese are very conservative in many ways. Yeah. They sent a due diligence team of 30 people to the offices to review the design. And they weren't looking at the turbine, which was their bit. Their instruction was, find out if this project actually makes any sense and is it a credible project? And the answer was yes. And they climbed in and paid half their own costs to develop the machine. Oh. It was seriously the next. I have no great doubt that the PBMR, if it had been supported in the right places in 2003, would have been by 2011, when Fukushima happened, would have been the classical inherently safe reactor that would have taken over the world. Now, I mean, you don't realize that when we first came in with that, I have this joke regularly. I went to IEA, and a lot of information came to the IEA. Was brilliant in terms of supporting us. There's no question there. But I went there and said, I have a 100 megawatt unit as a commercial machine. And they said, that can't be true.
Yeah.
That can't be true. And they said, well, excuse me, large reactors are 1200 plus, medium reactors are 900 to 1200, and smaller 6 to 900. There is nothing below 600 that is actually even worth talking about. Right. And I said, I work for a utility, which is the fourth biggest in the world and the lowest cost. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying we're going to make it work. And then I said, and the nice thing is it's inherently safe. It's walk away safe. There is no process that takes you from an event to release. And they said, you can't use that word. You cannot use the word inherently safe because that will imply that other reactors aren't inherently safe.
Oh, I see.
and therefore you can't use it. It's now, I think those two things have gone away, but back in the old, and I still look at SMRs, and I look on the same basis of, certainly on the second one, can you tell me, is your technology one, if you can work out how you can cause that to have an offsite, a signal offsite release, it'll fail. Because the trick with an SMR is to say, I've built a very conservative machine, but I have no safety systems, because the safety system is built into the fundamentals of the plant. And the classical one is a triso-based fuel high temperature reactor.
Yeah.
If you give it to my grandson, even my younger grandson, my youngest grandson, who's 3, and you say, go play with this thing, the worst he can do is write it off commercially, but he can't actually get the fuel to a high enough temperature. And the Chinese have shown this with their work on it's not a new piece of information, it's standard. But and then out of that, at the same time of that, ESCOM then, when ESCOM was looking at the new build, so ESCOM now suddenly in 2005-6 is saying, we've now got to meet the demand going forward for South African power. And ESCOM then climbed into a major build program, both for the 6-packs. And don't forget, we have Medupi and Kasili, but we also had Coal 3 and Coal 4 on the books. And we also had the whole nuclear fleet on the books, because we had to build about 50,000 megawatts of new plant by about 2030. Because if we'd stayed at the 3% growth rate, we would now be sitting in South Africa with a 55,000 megawatt, 60,000 megawatt peak demand.
Oh, so right? How much do we have at the moment?
About 35. Because, and we can't talk about demand on the ESCOM grid anymore, because demand is not constraining, it's supply that's constraining. To have a demand number, you've got to have enough spare margin that whatever you ask for, I'll give you. As soon as you say that I will only give you what I can give you, then you're suddenly staring at the ability of machinery to produce.
And in terms of the economy, that means recession, basically, or stagnation.
Well, the South African economy, if you look at the curves, you can argue very strongly is sitting at about 3/4 of what it should have been if we hadn't had a power crisis.
I think we're one of the first countries to have realized, probably not the first, the importance of energy. I make the same argument for water shortage, that you can have all the dreams of free market economies or social economy, whatever you want to call it. None of it works if the fundamentals aren't there. And I think this went missing in South Africa. I mean, water crisis is about the same as electricity crisis at this stage. And unless we address those things, we will never solve the unemployment and all the other problems going forward.
I'll give you a simple test. Not a test of you, but a test of any company. When you look at an organization and you pick up its annual report, there are 2 portions of the annual report normally. There's the first part, which explains the operations, and there's a chairman saying nice things. I know I just signed one from Nexa, which says nice things. And there's a CEO saying how it's running well and all the different bits and pieces and all the graphs of performance. And there's the back half of the document, which tells you what the income statement, the balance sheet, and the rest of it is. And very simple, if you are an interested and affected party and you pick up the annual report of a organization, I'll ask you, which do you read first? And if you're dealing with a mining house or Toyota, you read the money bit first. And then you read the front of the document to see if anything in the front of the document is going to disturb the back of the document. That is a company for profit. It doesn't care what it does. It wants to make money. So you go to a supermarket, Pick n Pay. What does Pick n Pay do? Pick n Pay makes money for its shareholders. It does it by running supermarkets. Yeah. But if you could go to Pick n Pay and persuade them that by selling their land off and liquidating the company, they could make lots of money, they would theoretically say, yes, we'll do that. If you read the first bit as your main document, and then you check if anything in the back bit is going to interfere with the front bit, either reverse argument, you're dealing with a utility. I would argue that for water, for many things, water, electricity, sewage, roads, you're reading the first bit first. That's a utility. The state has to make sure that happens. Some things used to be utilities and have now become commercial. So if I take telecoms, when I was a kid, telecoms were long-term investments with copper wires, and there was no way that you would use a commercial operation. You ended up with telephones that were essentially either regulated. We've now got a situation where no. Telephones are entirely deregulated. Why? Because the technology has fundamentally changed.
Yeah.
Now, people say, oh, but in the power sector it's changed. And I got a simple answer to that one. You're South African in Paris, and I'm a South African in South Africa, but also if in this country someone said tomorrow morning that Telkom has gone bankrupt and closed down, we go, oh, that's interesting. Yes, okay, I must change my contract because my contract is Telkom. If you were told that South African Airways had gone bankrupt, you said, well, haven't they already gone bankrupt? That's the discussion. Right, but essentially nobody would care. There's enough airlines out there. You've got to ask the question, if you believe that technology has changed so far that you don't need the utility business, you're now in the correct, then nobody should be worrying about Eskom going bankrupt. It should not be debate.
But obviously attached to that means you need regulation in place that allows people to add to the utility.
No, forget that. If you seriously believe, I mean, give an example. Everyone says, "Oh, you need regulation to change to make these." Cell phones have taken over Africa. If you go back to '94, when cell phones came to South Africa, there was Vodacom and there was MTN. And their biggest concern was that the cell phone market was seen as LSM 8 and above.
Yeah.
And their biggest concern was a big enough consumer base to justify the towers to have the coverage to expand the consumer base. That was their question. If you had pulled the head of marketing of MTN or Vodacom into your little room in 94 and said that in a few years' time, my gardener will have one, my maid will have two, and her grandson will have one, they'd look at you and say, you're out of your ruddy skull. Yeah. This is a luxury item. There was no policy on how cell phones should roll out across Africa. And yet countries like Kenya, I understand, run entirely on cell phones. They've just completely missed out landlines. Nobody gives a damn for landlines, right?
Yeah, and they will never know what it is to use a pencil to turn the
right, exactly. And they did that without a policy, without financial support, because the thing worked.
Yeah.
So when someone says to me, microgrids are the future of Africa, my answer is fine. If that's true, then stop worrying about it. They will take over Africa. They haven't even got close to it. They're still subsidizing them. Because the answer is, if you go to Kenya, I use Kenya as an example, any of the countries there, and you say to them, I have got a better way of running out landlines for your telephone system with an improved copper compound, they will look at you and say, what the heck are you talking about? Please stop wasting my time. But if you go to them today and you say, I've got a better way of building you a power grid, they will talk to you. Heavy industry in this country is dying because people are saying, I will not build a factory because there is no guarantee of power. But if you don't think Eskom's important, then if you believe microgrids and you believe solar powers, then what's the problem? You build your own power station.
Don't you think that's happening slowly but surely, or is it just not there yet? Because I mean, people are talking now, and remember, I always get skeptical when there's a lot of announcement in the media and lots of hype, So the green thing is now coming, we're all decarbonizing, it's all wind and solar all over the world, and batteries, which I think is ridiculous. And towns like Stellenbosch, for example, is saying they're going to be off-grid soon.
Yeah.
How realistic is that? Maybe not. I suspect for the rich, they were able to afford it because the tariffs are very high. But how realistic is it to power the whole country that way?
You're sitting in Paris, yes?
Yes.
That light over your head is being powered by an electron, by nuclear fission.
Yeah. When France has got 89.
Yeah, Germany next door has done the experiment that you're talking about.
And now they're buying from the French.
Well, they've always been buying the French, but the point is that it hasn't worked. They've had 20 years of saying, we're going to do this. Look at the rate at which technology takes over. I mean, people assume things happen slowly. They don't. I remember when I was first in the power business in the mid-'80s, which was when I came to Eskom, Century, combined cycle gas turbines and gas-fired plants were almost unheard of. And there's a reason behind that in terms of the Europeans and the logic of the Europeans saying they wouldn't let gas, and the Americans, you couldn't use gas for power generation. It was too valuable as a primary fuel. And in '89, at the same time as UK started privatizing its power industry, both in Europe and in the States, they decided that there was enough gas around that it wasn't a challenge anymore. You could use gas. What do you use gas for? And I remember years ago seeing a World Bank report in 1990 on the technology of combined cycle gas turbines, and it was very damning and saying they never really work anywhere. They were a nice idea, but don't work. 10 years later, 85% of all the new plant going in the world was combined cycle gas turbines.
85 all the new plants. Yeah.
All the new plants, yeah. And in fact, now I will just say to you that and the change has been massive. So the answer was there was an economic argument. Now I can argue whether it's good or bad economic argument, but the argument was gas was quite cheap and you could build it quickly and you got on there. Having said that, of course, because of the Californian crisis, there was 114 gigawatts of natural gas plant that was either delayed, abandoned, or deferred in the States post 2000 because of everyone has forgotten the fact that if everyone's buying gas, the price of gas will go up. This is pre-fracking, essentially. So my answer is that if you believe that renewables are going to win the war, then they should have won the war. And the most recent example, which in my view, blows out the current philosophy.
So cold.
What?
Oh, the recent call to my mind. I mean, in Germany, the panels had snow on them, and in Texas, the wind.
It's frozen. But let's go back home. In South Africa, the government went out and said we need some urgent 2,000 megawatts of power, 20-year PPAs, dispatchable plant. I must meet a load profile thing. Anybody can bid with anything, but it must be quick. And everyone's now complaining bitterly about two things. The first is that Turkish gas-fired diesel engines on ships won 2/3 of the bid, and that the pricing they came in at was about R1.50 kilowatt hour, which is way outside the expectation of the IRP. If you believe the IRP, then the response to that RFP should have clearly been wind and solar and a little bit of gas to make up for when the thing isn't there. And quite bluntly, it did. And it should have come in at a price of about R1.10, if you believe the IRP numbers.
So I have a question for you, one of the commentators.
Yeah.
While we're on the point, it says, what do you think of the power ships that are supposed to come for 20 years? I mean, you just touched on it. So there's a lot of speculation on the media that it is too expensive, it is not expensive.
Yeah.
How should we gauge it?
Well, the answer to the question is that you've got to, any utility business, understand the schedule, that if you want to build any new plant in South Africa today, let me go in short form. Yeah. You've got to understand that it'll be coming on stream after 2030. Be that large-scale coal, large-scale nuclear, large-scale hydro, or even natural gas. Because we haven't got any natural gas, so you've got to put the infrastructure in. No one's got any idea how to pay for that. So the natural gas argument is, well, gas costs $10 a gigajoule, which is quite expensive, but no one asks who's going to buy and own the infrastructure to make all the natural gas work and who's going to pay for it. The state's going to have to do that, but the state is not involved because it's a free market, so you've got a problem there. My view is that this whole saga with the power ships, or the whole of this project, is you've let the free market have its way. You've said, let's go out there and see what we can do.
Yeah.
And the answer is it's come in way more expensive, and there'll be many. And so to me, if I was the guy with the contract, they haven't got financial closure yet, so let's be careful. There's a few missing steps in this pause. I mean, like, for example, they've got no approval to park their ships in these harbors 20 years. So there's all kinds of issues there. But assuming it all goes through, that's life. We've signed contracts at much higher rates of money for renewables that provide power when they feel like it, with 20-year contracts on them as well.
But Dave, so, if I look at the media, it tells me renewables have never been cheaper. It tells me it's the next best thing since it tells me that they are paying me to use electricity.
Right. Then my only question to that one is, why didn't they win hands down with this medium-term power bid? And that's the problem we've got, is that people don't like it because Eskom's national control, or somebody wrote the specification saying it's what we need. We need plant that can do this, about a 60-70% load factor over this profile, blah, 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 blah. And it went to the marketplace with absolutely no constraint. You could have been a nuclear power station. I mean, you wouldn't have won because the nuclear station would have been not in service till 2030, so it would have missed the window. But that was the problem they had. That what you've got back is exactly what the market says. No. And I mean, so that's the trouble, is that I'm an engineer by nature and trade. I always say I'm a simple engineer. And that doesn't mean I'm stupid. It just means that I believe that all problems are simple problems. You add them together, they look complicated, but you break them down, actually they're quite simple. And whenever I do a Excel spreadsheet or a model to go and model something, one of the first things you do, having done this little model, is you then put in some real world data and see if you get if the result your model gives you relates to the real world that's out there.
Yeah.
As you go with me, simple technique. Then you put in your modified data and you say, it wins for some reason or other. Okay, so tell me where in the world that renewables have actually worked. If you ask me about Germany, California, Australia, their costs are higher than the costs in their other comparative areas.
The one I saw that's the cheapest, and this stuff from PV magazine, so photovoltaic magazine, they probably have their own biases, but it's Israel. They
saw that.
Cheap. I saw that. I don't know the details on it.
It was PV and a battery, and my argument is that is that good. Then can someone tell me why we didn't get that bid for the South African medium-term just closed power bids?
Something, unless it's a loose ender, maybe. I don't know.
Well, I'll give you an answer differently. And I've told that one of the key things in all financing is the cost of capital. There's a whole pile of key questions in there. What are your penalties? What else? And one of the key questions is what's your cost of capital? Now, the South African IRP assumed 8.2% real. Understand that real is add inflation to real. So current interest rate, and that penalizes heavy capital items and goes towards less capital items. What's interesting about that one is that I would love to know what the interest rate was the financing rate is for these bids, but I will guarantee you that they're probably talking about 3% real.
Yeah.
So the entire setup has done it in a way that in my opinion, simply says that the fundamental assumptions in the IRP are fundamentally flawed. Now, there is a very nasty rationale for that. I'd be a bit careful when I say this, is that one of the problems with nuclear power, and it's a real problem with nuclear power, is that when you negotiate a nuclear deal, and we did that, I've done that for Eskom in 2007, 2008, and we were going into it in 2016 before the judge got in the way, is that it's a negotiation because of the way you do nuclear stations. They're built as turnkey objects. You go and you don't buy a boiler, a reactor from him, and a turbine from him, and a steam generator from him. You buy the whole thing. So what's fascinating is that you realize that you will negotiate largely in the state organization, because the time frame of a nuclear plant is so long that no bank without sovereign guarantees better get involved. And the quantum is quite large. So the state, essentially a state organ, negotiates with a foreign state organ. We're importing nuclear plants now. And the financing for a single turnkey deal, you will give me a nuclear power station after 8 years construction with this performance. And the financing is done by a state-to-state agreement, essentially, which is incredibly low-cost financing. Right?
Isn't that the indirect subsidy, though?
No, it's because the financing, because the risk is being absorbed. But just bear in mind a second. You're now being, because the real problem is very simple. Where do I get my pound of flesh as a deal maker? If I'm going to be on the construction side, there were no clever contracts between people. I'm not trying to link things together. The vendor will come in with his experienced team and say, I want to buy concrete, I want to buy rebar, I want to buy these things. You can do those, and there's lots of money going to get spent on those, but they're going to be all driving straightforward commercial activity. So if you can't build a good enough valve, you won't get involved in that game. And the financing is done at a low cost rate, so that you say a subsidy. My answer is it removes the middleman. And you can see that at the moment, the bid window 1 to 3 have been very expensive, not because of the technology, but because the middlemen have taken their nice chunk out of the process. Yeah. And there are no middlemen. And one of the issues of the power business, and I'll be very blunt about it, in South Africa now, the power business is what? 250 billion rand a year plus turnover. And if you're a free market plant developer, the last thing you want is to leave that in government hands. You almost, if your model says the best solution is the government does it through an agency, then what's in it for me? So in a society where you're trying to get lots of deals made, your deal makers don't like big deals. They like lots of little deals.
They like, because there's lots of fat to eat from. And then the other problem.
And I take 10% on this deal, and yeah.
But the problem we faced at ITER, for example, the thermonuclear reactor, was it's also a long-term project. Look, it's 1980 it started. It's probably only going to be finished in 2030 or 35 or God knows when. The problem is they come up with different types of contracts in between. But you find the people who negotiate the contracts play musical chairs. So there's an incentive structure to not complete the project at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And it delays the project, it blows up costs. All these issues you're speaking of,
People, a good example. If you go for when we did the Coburg contract, and the same terms were basically built into the 2007, 2008 Nuclear One contracts that were never signed, but they were ready to be signed. Then it was a turnkey deal. There were penalty clauses if you were delaying by a day. I think it was $1.5 million a day or something for being late on a project, and similarly vicious ones on power and everything else. And the reason that's interesting is because you could do that because you're buying it. They take the integration risk. People say, why aren't the penalties being paid for being late on Medupi and Cassini? And the answer is even if the two engineering companies talk to each other, that's it, simple, the boiler and the turbine guy, actually talk. The reality is legally they're passing through Eskom. Yeah. So every mistake that's made is Eskom's problem.
Which means the taxpayer's problem.
You can't sue them. Unless you go, a very small item, but not on the big issues. And so there's a whole pile of problems built into that one as well. But that's where you basically come from. That you're, now you stopped me in mid-face. In terms of South African crisis, sorry, you stopped me earlier. I realized I lost track of something. When Eskom was doing Nuclear One, mentioned nuclear deals, Nuclear One, it was doing, and over 20,000 megawatts being built in quite a reasonable short time frame, a la the French almost. We had coal contracts. At the end of 2008, Eskom realized that the way the tariff was being structured, the way the whole industry was structured, it couldn't afford to fund all this lot. And so Eskom abandoned it. And the real crisis we're sitting with now, going forward, Eskom next 20 years, is driven by the 2008 decision that Eskom would not proceed with nuclear build program, it would not proceed with Coal 3 or Coal 4. It essentially said we cannot meet the requirement to keep the lights on post 2015, 16, which is what those stations would be doing.
Wow. So at the moment, there's lots of talk also in the media about the new nuclear power station.
Yeah.
You should obviously be aware of that. What is the status of that? Are we ever going to get it? Is it going to come in 2030, or is it too expensive? And just on top of that, as to add up question, there's talk when I speak to people who are opposed to nuclear in South Africa. I've spoken to a few of them. They keep on telling me they are not ideologically opposed to nuclear, but they feel the process is not transparent enough. Is that a fair accusation or not?
Oh, no, it's not in the least bit fair. I mean, nuclear is the most transparent industry there is in so many ways. And it's almost hilarious how the anti-lobby declares that we're too secretive. So give us your board minutes on when you decided to do this. Well, excuse me, if you don't get board minutes from deciding the commercial processes normally. Let me tell you where we stand now and what's going on. Okay, so we now have an IRP which has said what we're going to build between now and 2030. In other words, what's going to be commissioned each year from now to 2030. And while some things in that are true, the majority are never going to get commissioned because this timeline of any major project is about 10 years. And that's not a nuclear discussion. That includes, if you're in coal, you would have problems getting the EIAs, getting the nuclear thing, getting the coal mine sorted out. If you go out natural gas, you've got a massive problem of infrastructure to get you the gas. So yes, you can bring a power barge in, but it comes with its own gas source. But if you want to if you want to build a pipeline and you want to build storage systems like in Europe with a massive gas infrastructure, that takes years. And contractually, who takes what contract? So all those things. So essentially, we've got a situation now where we've got an IRP which goes 2030, which in my view is close to being, has little value, largely because it doesn't discuss what happens post 2030. Right? Now, I just talk also got brief about ESCOM. ESCOM has is now flatlining in terms of capacity. It's got two things going on in parallel. It's got the old storage stations getting steadily worse, the end of the bathtub curve, or you know what the bathtub curve is. Yeah. And you've got two new stations, which will in 5 years' time be great. And everyone says, oh, they're doomed. No, they're going to work. We've had it, every single ESCOM coal station has been a massive challenge at some point. But it's in the front end of the bathtub curve. We didn't know, we were learning as we went along. So if you give me forward 5 years, that'll be leveled off and okay. Yeah. So what we're facing is, so at the moment, what we're facing now is the decommissioning of the old coal stations. And that's inevitable. It's not some policy decision of it shouldn't last more than 50 years. We are seeing from the results of the performance of the coal stations, they're falling apart in terms of their performance.
These are the ones that clip, for example, and...
No, well, it's Kamati, Kutfe, Camden. And everyone says, but the newer stations are better. No, they're not. They're just further down the curve. And so we just literally, and I said, we were building 1.5 to 2,000 megawatts of new plant a year back in the late 70s through to the end of the 80s. So we have got to replace them. They're going to go out of service in the same time frame as they came in.
Where are we going to find the money?
Oh, that's easy. Yeah. Can I come back to the money? Don't forget, come back to the money in a second, Hugo. I'll come back to the money.
Still have some few minutes of time.
Yeah, I've got no constraint.
Okay, let's keep on talking because people are enjoying it. I see I've got people listening as well, so they're getting insight from ESCOM, you know.
Oh, I'm an ESCOM. I'm a retired pensioner who gets a pension from ESCOM. It's your ESCOM pension fund, not ESCOM. Let's be careful. Okay. So the real answer is that we're going to hit a problem that we've now stopped growth in the economy for the last 10 years because of lack of power, 10 to 15 years. If we don't build something serious, and I'm sorry, I do not mean more wind turbines or PV, because you don't want to mine on a wind turbine or a PV, then we're going to have another problem. So for the last 10 years, we've been told if you want to build a new mine, you won't get the power to do it, build your own power station, which doesn't make sense to anybody, but that's what you essentially say to them. And in about, certainly within 10 years, we're going to be decommissioning stations. So we've now got the 10,000 megawatts, roughly speaking, of Medupi-Kasili come in to make up for which is getting more and more reliable as the other stations are getting less and less reliable. That line crosses over in about 2028, when suddenly you've got Medupi-Kasili probably at full availability, back up to 90% availability, running like Camden, like Kendall was in the 1990s or 2000s. And you're now decommissioning at 2,000 megawatts a year. So you're no longer going to be saying, I cannot provide power to your new mine. I'm going to say, I'm removing power from your old mine. Choose which mine you close down first. So the answer is we've got to do a major activity to get new generation plants of some kind on the line by 2030 or so. Now, realistically, a nuclear plant's probably about 2032 is the fastest consensus will be done at the moment. So let's come back to your question. I'll come back to money in a second, but I'll come back to the question, where does the program go now? So what's happened is in this project, we've now got the IRP included. Now, given this fact that the IRP only looks at 10 years, which is, as I said, not very useful because it doesn't tell you, because that's development time for a project. There is an explicit clause that we should prepare for the procurement of 2,500 megawatts of nuclear plants. And that has resulted in a request for information being sent out last year, I think it was June, which closed in October, and a Section 34, which is the legal sort of almost license to start work on projects being issued or forwarded by the minister to NERSA. Now, NERSA is the energy regulator, not the nuclear, the energy regulator. Mm-hmm. And it's got to essentially concur with the minister's views and have public participation process the process. So they've started that process going, and the public participation process happened last month. month before last, and that was very interesting. Very interesting discussion because we got a lot of pro-nuclear voices in there. It wasn't just the classical anti-lobby, and I would argue the pro-lobby was more scientific and the anti-lobby was more emotional.
You know, my view is, having spoken to on various YouTube podcasts, for what it's worth, South Africans are not opposed to nuclear power. They're actually in favor of it. Okay,
I don't see a problem with
Germans, right? There's two people that are opposed to it. One works at UCT, I won't name, and one works at UJ, which has been on my show, but I won't name him either. So there's only two people.
There's also guys at CSIR as well, don't the CSIR as well?
Yeah, but they're funded by the same people in Germany. Like we all know, just look at their funders, okay?
Yeah.
And I just make this point. So you just make the point for people who are listening as well. South Africa doesn't have energy. We don't have the luxury of debating the dogma as to which power source you need to take. We need to take what we've got, okay? Even if that means solar and wind and it's not perfect. Like you bring it all on, you know?
Well, the biggest issue, we've got no neighbours. I mean, the Germans can play games and the Danes can play games. I mean, the Danish trade more power than they use through their links into Germany, into France, into the Nordic pool. Germany is always importing or exporting. We have no neighbours. I mean, we have neighbours, but they're so small we can largely ignore them. At one point, I remember the Carlton Tower in centre of Johannesburg used more power than Mozambique did. That's one building versus a country, and it wasn't a very, it was a medium-sized office block. So where we stand now? We stand now, you asked the question about where we're going. We stand now that the RFI has had the results in. They've been discussed, I think have been discussed with Parliament. Very much what was expected, I believe. The interesting one was the RFI was explicit about looking at large-scale PWRs and potentially SMRs. And the and the Section 32 determination also talks about the two things. And the public debate has occurred, and I understand, but it's just my understanding, is that NERSA is hoping to give a finding on it by the end of this month.
Okay.
Logically, once that is done, you'll be in a situation to issue requests for proposals. Now, it won't be as simple as saying on 28th of April, somebody gives somebody a Section 34 determination, and on the 29th, they issue a request for proposal. It'll take some months, let's say till July, August, to get that together. My assumption, and I want to be careful, you are somebody who's not involved in this process theoretically. My assumption is, and what I'm personally supporting in all my conversations, is the Western Cape has only got Coburg at the moment as a baseload dispatchable plant.
Correct. Yeah.
And Coburg was built, it was commissioned in the mid-80s when the power demand in the Western Cape was half what it is now. It is logical to put two more 1,000 megawatt machines, plus or minus, on the Coburg site. There's plenty of space. We've got an EIA half approved for that, or approved under appeal, but it's approved. And that would give us, and that would be a straightforward, go out there, open tender, who wants to build this plant, give me a cost, and you bring financing with you, by the way. You link the financing to the PPA. That's straightforward.
So the accusation last time was that it was going to be the Russians and it was a R1 trillion deal or something of the sort. And I guess that's what we saw on the news. I at the time thought it was the same thing.
Can I just finish off and then I'll come back to that? I want to come back to that. So the other one is a small modular reactor. And my view of that one is that's the machine we should be rolling out to replace the coal stations on the Highveld. And my personal view is that we should go out, we should commit to a first machine, 100 megawatts something, on the Nexa site as the developmental machine. I mean, it's something else technology, but essentially, and then also a technology center for the country, training center, and then roll it out over the next few years over the coal system. But if you come back to the Russian deal, and I use the word Russian deal in that sense, because I was asked the same question. I kept saying, I don't know, I'm running ESCOM's program, I don't know about Russian deal. There is no, in my view, there's no question that in about 2014, the government was trying to sign a MOU with the Russians that was the precursor to a contract. Yeah. Right? And that's how it's normally done, by the way. From that date onwards, when that blew up in their faces, they didn't go back to that. There was going to be an open tender. And in fact, the request for information that was going on as the court case was being heard in 2016 explicitly said we're going to go out to open tender, and explicitly said we're going to look for 2 machines first with the option for more. So my answer to those general questions is nobody wanted to listen to the debate. I'm going standing in a public meeting and saying the proposal at the moment is to go open tender for 2 machines with the option to buy more. And everyone said, well, if you're doing that, then what's the problem about it? And I said, well, we've never said anything else. But the anti-lobby has made it the Russian deal, the $1 trillion deal, trillion rand deal. And then you come around and say, well, depending on how you work numbers out, you get any number you want to. What is interesting is that the sovereign guarantees for the renewables exceed the price of the first 2 nuclear machines. The existing sovereign guarantees are greater than the contract price.
Yeah, but you know what it's all about from the beginning, right? It's because I see this a lot in the energy sector. I mean, I work in gas at the moment, but work in nuclear. Everyone is trying to play angels and demons here, right? Everyone is trying to make the other one look worse off. Investing in ideas. I don't think there's another industry that invests more into ideas than the nuclear industry. So we try and create a mythology around carbon or around nuclear being bad or whatever, abiogenic theory of fossil fuels. There's a lot of this nonsense going around. And all it really does is saying, I'm holy and I'm better and you should buy me and not buy the opponent. And I get that impression that's what's happening.
I think it is. And I'll give you another example, which is not anywhere near us, but I'm watching the Belgian situation with absolute fascination. The Belgians are 50% nuclear with Tihange and the 2 stations they've got, 7 units. And they're going to close them all down in the next 4 years. And there is no plan to replace them with anything else, as far as I can make out. And there's no attempt to argue that carbon emissions will not go through the roof because it'll be natural gas.
And right next door, you've got the Dutch who says they want to have nuclear power 50% or 60%. Well,
everybody's starting to come to terms with the fact. I mean, you come back to the argument that the World Wildlife Fund did a study, and I read this one a couple of days ago, which actually was looking at the relevant success of different countries in Europe. I didn't even saw this one. The World Wildlife Fund said that for the purpose of the study, they were going to assume that nuclear emitted 350 grams per kilowatt hour of carbon.
Just assume.
Oh, well, the real answer agreed in the IPCC is 12, by the way.
But that's even lower. Do you know why?
Yeah, no. And the Swiss and the Swedes claim like 5 or something. I mean, but 350 is like a meaningless number.
Concrete, basically.
Yeah, it's not even. Let's go. But the answer to the question is that you've got a situation where, you can't allow nuclear into the debate. Look at the taxonomy debate now in the European Parliament. As soon as you allow nuclear into the deal, then suddenly you've got a solution to carbon, the climate change, which has been demonstrated already. In the 70s and 80s, we were installing nuclear plants at a rate that would meet the requirements for climate change mitigation.
Yeah.
So and nobody's arguing, but you can't run a country on nuclear. Well, ask the French. They do it.
And the Swedish.
And well, the Swedes are half nuclear and half hydro.
And France and Sweden has I think it's second and third cheapest in Europe. The cheapest is Poland, and they have coal. And my view has been, look, if the new generation coal technologies has got, I think, 45% efficiency, they don't even burn as much carbon as people think. This coal power stations in China barely leads it out. So my view has just been go for the cheapest. I'm in favor of nuclear. I'm saying let's build it if we can. But like this decarbonization for Africa. I mean, Africa's problem is we don't have a carbon footprint, and now we want to talk about this as if it's the end of the world.
Yeah, my view of the whole carbon debate is extremely simple. I'm forthright in areas I understand, and I'm not going to get told by somebody that nuclear emits 50 grams of carbon. That doesn't happen. But something climate science, I don't understand it. I've got several good friends who are complete disbelievers in climate change, in the sense of carbon dioxide being the primary cause. I don't know. What I do know is that politically it's a truth for the next 10 years. And so if you try and finance a coal-fired power station, you will get significant challenge to do so. We can see it already because in South Africa, the 2 coal IPPs that are supposed to get built, the 700-800 megawatts of coal, have both had all their funding withdrawn by the banks. You can argue the science. I'm not going to try and argue the science, just not going to try and argue the science. But I'm going to say that politically it's true. And perhaps I'm in the nuclear game too long is that I recognize that political truths are often more important than actual truths.
What's the difference?
Oh, the difference is that a political truth is the fact that nuclear is bad for you and is high danger. The actual truth is that the total death toll from nuclear power in the last 50, 60 years has been like 50 people at Chernobyl. And everything else is the concept of linear threshold is like, please, if I tried to sell linear threshold,
that's just my worry about the nuclear stuff is that it's so easy for an opportunist and a propagandist and an environmentalist and anyone with an agenda to just say, look, nuclear is bad, and there's been a leak, there's a crack in Koeberg, for example, and then all of a sudden it's the end of the world. And then the politicians overreact. And how do you address that?
My experience with politicians, and I'm just careful on that. My belief is our industry has been far too defensive. Let me give 2 stories, and I think we've overshot time slightly nicer, but I'll give you 2 stories quickly, and then I'll come. The first story is we were trying to get acceptance of putting a nuclear plant in Cape St. Francis, which is down in Eastern Cape, near west of Port Elizabeth. And we were going along doing a very classical nuclear thing of, look how little effect we have. We have so little effect. You really can't complain. We are little effects. Not relatively little, actually it's little. We never said we are littler than a wind turbine. We just said we're little. I'm annoying them all desperately because they keep saying to me, what about this? I say, well, I'm the engineering manager. You tell me what your problem is, and I'll go and find a way to engineer out of the way. I've got enough money to do that. But we were struggling, and then suddenly we realized something else. And I just told my guy, a guy called Luis Tawashi, who was driving that side, I said to him, Luis, just go down there and say a 2-unit station in Cape St. Francis, right next to Humansdorp, right? Or Thatchy Tastebud, will have about minimum $10 billion of expenditure, of which 25% minimum we spent within 20 kilometers of the site because you're digging holes in the ground and pouring concrete. And that means we're going to spend $2.5 billion in your local area, which if you put exchange rate on that, becomes about 40 billion rand. But don't worry, because there's another 10 billion rands being spent by Eskom in building houses, sewage, roads, and everything else. And they said, oh, when are you going to start? And the answer is we stopped trying to say how little damage we did, and we started saying how much good we did.
Yeah.
And
we need a PR. There's no.
But it's also our own culture. We're too afraid. The other one I'll give you, I used to have I've got a couple of friends who are more radical than I am, and when I was doing PPMR, I'd occasionally try and arrange interviews where there would be the Earth Life Africa person, myself, and my friend or the other person. And I would then be the average person in the middle being quite reasonable. And they'd be off the end extreme both sides. Because normally a person looks at 2 people debating and assumes that neither are right. The truth is somewhere in the middle.
I see.
And so we keep saying a very balanced view of it. So, and I'm great one for simple things. Like this thing about tell me where renewables have worked. Just tell me where it's cheap. People talk about nuclear waste. And I'm saying, well, okay, we have less than half a tennis court of nuclear waste from Koeberg. What's your problem?
Yeah, I know in France the statistic is all the high-level waste in France can fit 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Yeah. And they're somewhere in the middle of nowhere.
And so the answer is you turn around and say, and how many people have been hurt by, if you actually have an accident with a nuclear waste transport system, the problem is your car will get crushed. The flask is fine, but if it falls off the lorry on anything else, that something else will get crushed. But the idea of actually damaging the cask and releasing activity is like, no, not going to happen. You need almost a militarization.
Radioactivity, and then they go overboard as well. I mean, your light bulb is semi-radioactive. A banana is radioactive. How much is it ionizing, or there's a lot of nuance to that.
Well, I mean, you shouldn't. I mean, then you just start when someone talks about radiation levels. You point out that under South African regulations, you cannot build a nuclear power station in Cornwall. And you may say, what's that got to do with it? The answer is because the NNR at one time said the average dose to the working people mustn't exceed 400 millirem a year from all sources, including the nuclear reactor. For the nuclear power station, that was easy, but the background radiation in Cornwall is actually about 1 rem a year. So you can't. So no. Cornwall, and I mentioned Cornwall, I used to live there. Cornwall actually is legally a nuclear waste dump according to UK regulations. And if you apply Chernobyl lifetime dose rates, you should evacuate Cornwall because of the background radiation. Not because of Chernobyl, but because if you apply Chernobyl background radiation. So you've got to have that kind of discussion and be that aggressive in the discussion. You can't just sit there.
But you see, the problem is what
16 risk of widgets.
Activists constantly expose people's innumeracy and just lack of scientific knowledge. Not everyone understands nuclear stuff, of course not. That's why you need a technocratic person running it. I mean, you cannot put any idiot onto it, somebody like you, and he should at least inform the public.
Idiot, be careful there. I'll give you the answer. Yeah, I'll give you the answer I often give people. I have a pet thing I talk about, which is batteries. Okay, batteries are getting cheaper and becoming clever and everything else. The whole statement of that. Yeah. And they're the future. Right, and then you turn around and say, excuse me, do you drive a motor car? Do you drive a motor car, Hugo?
Not here, but I did in South Africa, yeah.
Okay, fine. I guess it wasn't electric, it was an internal combustion engine.
Yes, it was a very old car as well. It still used unleaded fuel.
Whatever, and I'll go to, you're ruining my argument, but I'll keep going. But the fun discussion is, there's two things about motor car companies, Toyota and else that you know about. One is they're prepared to be very high tech. I drove an XC90, a Volvo, newish Volvo, about 4 years old now. Got a computer system and a touch screen and everything else. It really is pretty scary stuff. So they're quite happy to be high tech, and they're also driven by cost management. So they will get the cost as low as they possibly can. They would save 20 cents if they could on a car. Yes?
No.
Now, when you had your car in South Africa, and in fact, if you go out your window now and look at the next car you see, which is not a Tesla, and look at that one, you will say it has got a battery in there as the reserve power to start the engine. Yes?
No.
That battery must, by definition, be the lowest cost, highest tech battery that is worth it for the car industry.
Yeah, but there's a caveat to that argument.
Stop. I'm not doing caveats.
Okay.
It's a lead acid battery, 1859.
Yeah.
And lithium-ion batteries have now got a stage where their cost is not driven by learning, it's driven by the amount of lithium and cobalt and materials in the battery. Yeah. So it ain't, and you're struggling to get the lithium-ion batteries down to the price of a lead-acid battery. We're about there now.
Yeah, I think what we're referring to here is physical limits. Any technology has a physical limit, and you cannot get, blood out of a rock, for example. And once you hit physical limits, your cost, that's essentially what brings down your cost curve. I am hearing stories that batteries are getting cheaper and cheaper. I'm not seeing it in the application yet. There's some of it. There's nothing to it. People are talking of different types of batteries. Look, there's lots of innovation happening in batteries, and I'm all for innovation. But again, as with the combustion engine, I am quite incredulous to all these claims being made of changing society. And I think what it comes down to is this, that we've had an IT revolution for so long where you get a new computer code every week and voila, software changes. And we're used to the world changing rapidly, in the digital age. But if you go to your kitchens the same as the 1950s, we've got newer sources of power, gas, etc., etc. But eventually that curve gets to a point where physics cannot get it any much better. And I think that's going to happen with batteries. And then people will realize, okay, this is what it will cost. It will probably not get much cheaper. And these are the applications,
I want to be pedantic because while you were talking, I just typed in my PC out. So I typed into Google, and the Google of the world, I think it's Yahoo actually, solar batteries, right? Yeah. So let's see what they came up with. Pardon me, is they came up with the first one was was lithium iron phosphate, and the second one was deep cycled lead acid, and the third one, and so on. So the answer is that even today, literally today as we speak, people are claiming the lowest cost battery is 1859 design. And in a lead acid battery, most of the price is the price of the lead.
And the price won't come down much. It may, it can somewhat, but.
Well, it's an extraction price. So super cycles, if lithium is, so my answer is that but we've got to be more forceful and less apologetic. And we've also got a situation which is quite true, is that when you work for a utility, which is partly nuclear and largely coal, let's say Eskom or any of those discussions, you cannot turn around and say, our coal stations are killing more people per year than you claim Chernobyl ever killed.
Yeah, you cannot, because you work for them now.
You just can't do that. And in fact, what you've got a situation is there was an entire culture where it is fine. I remember going to conferences and presenting. I was a couple of years ago, and they were asking us to present our technology, and everybody else was bashing coal and bashing nuclear. There was a wind person, a solar person, a gas person. They all bought. And I stood up and I then presented the economics of intermittency as my opening statements. And they were appalled I had dared to suggest that renewables weren't perfect.
But why?
And that's the culture we haven't got into.
Why is it so ideological? I don't know if it's a consequence of social media or what it is, but you cannot raise that argument. I mean, I've pointed out that as somebody working in natural gas, I'm smiling all the way with renewables and wind, because I know that they will need it for the backup. It's well established in the industry that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you have gas, a peaker plant, supplying it. And I've made this statement in some conferences with renewables, and they want to attack you like you're the heretic. And I said, well, you should like me for it, because I'm actually selling your product. I'm saying sell renewables.
Hugo, the economics are interesting here, and you've got to get the economic right, because the problem with renewables, if you talk about renewables as the PV and the wind, and I mean, forget it, and they've got some kind of backup, is their problem is very interesting. They have got to have a backup.
Yeah. And
the backup, the variable cost of the backup must be less than the total cost of the renewable.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're putting putting gas in, and the gas is $8 a gigajoule, for example, just a number to go, then I've got a figure that I can probably justify having a complete gas system with the gas supply, because when I run my PV or my solar, I am saving the $8 a gigajoule. It's probably in our terms about R1 a kilowatt hour. So excuse me, this sort of makes sense that I can make sense. The trouble you've got is that if you make the gas too cheap, let's call it US gas in fracking at $2 a gigajoule or million, then you suddenly find yourself, say, a situation where actually, if you're going to build 1,000 megawatt to run over the whole time, then it's just, why bother with renewables? Because they cost more.
That's my argument. But then the argument comes in carbon emissions and carbon pricing.
But now you're into the real gas problem, because you guys leak methane.
But methane's not CO2, not yet. It's
no. Methane's 84 times worse than CO2. Please, Hugo. But
CO2 is the only problem. I mean, you have to be, but this is the problem.
Well, I think you're losing that argument as well slowly. And the other problem you've got to have is you're going to have a high discount rate, because if the discount rate is too low in your calculations, then suddenly the nuclear of this world, or the coal, or the big hydro, beats the natural gas. And once you've got those in there, then your marginal cost of fuel in a nuclear plant, in South African terms, is about maybe 10 cents. So suddenly you've got to meet your renewables cost less than 10 cents. And that really is a challenge for anybody. So you've got this sort of cherry pick your numbers to make it work. And the real answer is to stand there. And I come back to it. The average person in the street, you just stand there and you say, tell me where in the world, why has Germany got the highest cost of power in Europe? And you'll find most of that, but that's because of all the taxes. But most of the taxes are actually cross subsidies to pay the feed-in tariff and to pay the grid expansion and to pay all these
things. The consequence of this has been the fastest growing economy in the Eurozone the last 5 years. I think in Western Europe, maybe not Eastern Europeans, it's been France. It's not been Germany. And you have to ask yourself why. Now, I mean, I am, just say, very neutral. I'm a structural engineer, so I build this stuff. You can give me anything. I'm building an offshore wind farm at the moment, by the way, and I'm selling gas. You know, people haven't connected the dots yet, but whatever. You know, give me the project, I'll build it, I'll make it work.
No. I mean, hey, you do. I'm thinking of putting solar panels on my roof because the tariff makes it make sense for me.
Yeah.
You know, I don't believe it's the right answer for the country, but it might be the right answer for my bank account.
Yeah, well, exactly. So you think of your bank account first, and you react to the economic incentive. But the argument I've got is in terms of overall for the economy. If the German price of electricity is so expensive, and they actually added extra coal power stations, they added more than the entire Africa combined in 10 years, you need to rethink your assumptions. So my view has just been the cheapest in Europe with carbon emissions, if we tell it, is Poland. Okay, it's coal. If we go second or third, you can get to France and Sweden and maybe Norway, but they've got they're blessed with geography and water. So the point is just go for what is cheapest, go for what makes economic sense, especially when you're trying to lift people out of poverty. You know, and so if nuclear does the job, let them do it.
And I think that the real problem with nuclear, and I really must close the discussion because we've gone on for unless you're.
Yeah.
But the real problem, the thing in nuclear is that the cost of the actual physical plant. So if you forget about SMR, talk about classical pressurized water reactors. Essentially, what I see is that the actual cost of building one, if you're really skilled and everything's in place, is about $2,000 a kilowatt.
Okay.
The engineering cost and everything else could take an imported machine, the first of class imported, to $4,000 to $5,000 a kilowatt. And if you're doing a first of class design-wise, it can be whatever you want to make it. You know, ask Gold Colota. But the real answer is that therefore you get a situation where you've got this massive debate between someone who quotes Flamanville 3's costs and a cost of capital at 10%, which is what they're quoting for Hinkley Point C, but there's a whole story behind that, which I won't go into. And then you say that's too expensive. But then you say, well, actually, what about the Chinese, the Russians, and the Indians, and the Koreans, who are all saying their domestic programs, where they're in a serious construction, is coming in at about $2,500 a kilowatt total cost of the project.
Okay.
And their cost of capital is about 2% real. And then suddenly you realize they're coming in South African terms at about 40 cents a unit. Total. Okay. Total.
And how much do those ships, the Turkish ships, cost for comparison?
Well, they're £1. They're averaging at £1.70 or something.
Okay, so they're 40. So they're cheaper than the Turkish ships.
No. But because be careful. Yeah. That's like saying that's a bit like talking about the Israeli special deal. That is when you've built your first 8 of them and you've got everything sorted out, and your regulator is saying the design is certified. I just check you build it as you built the last one. Your operating training costs you nothing because you just simply have a whole pile of guys trained the same way. The lessons the French learned with their program.
I've got a question for you here, by the way, on the cost of the storage. My understanding from nuclear has been that tariff that we're now talking about, that 40 cents or however it might be, includes the cost of storage and decommissioning as well. Is that true?
Oh, the cost of storage and decommissioning is included in the costing of. I can't speak in almost all stations. Certainly for Coburg, it's included. Now, There was a question raised recently about is the money being put aside for that? So in Eskom's annual report, there is a provision. I forget the number it is now. It's like sort of 16 billion rand for decommissioning to date and spent fuel storage to date. And has Eskom got a bank account with 16 billion rand in it? Probably the answer is no, but it's on the books. Now, what's really interesting is that there's 2 different amounts there. One is for spent fuel and one is for decommissioning. Decommissioning is the same, realistically, whenever the station is decommissioned. So the question is, how long does the station last and what discount rate do you assume in your economics? So if Coburg goes from in Eskom's books, it still says 40-year decommissioning for Coburg, which is 2024. As soon as you make that 2044, then essentially the amount of money required is almost zero because you get the money back in the next 20 years of building.
So if we do a life extension, we can get back the money.
Yeah. That's logical.
There's no issue then. There's no issue. And just on decommissioning, my understanding of it, at least in France, has been it's not as complicated as people think. You take a diamond blade, you cut down the concrete and the steel, and you put it in a hole, or wherever.
Yeah. And the biggest single cost, well, two things. It's not as complicated as people think it is. Some of the older designs that were really weird. So first of all, it's been done across the world, not massively, because it's much cheaper just to leave the damn thing there for 100 years. You're not going to use a landmark.
Just put the beware of the dog sign on here.
Yeah. And the second one is interesting, is a lot of the costs are a function of the cost of your disposal of the final waste in your disposal site.
Yeah.
And in South Africa particularly, I mentioned earlier, we've got the Valputs in the Karoo, which is both geographically enormous and, for good luck, is also a shallow burial system, because the water table doesn't move there. So essentially, a lot of the reason why costs vary between countries is two differences. One is the degree to which you've got to engineer it. And the French, for example, are very well situated because they'll have 34 machines the same. You just go and same thing. You're like a production line. But the other one is how much is your spent fuel, is your disposal cost costing you? And so in South Africa, particularly, it's really the cost of taking in a lorry up to the Karoo. And digging a trench and putting it there and putting it on. And so, no, it's not a massive issue. It's been made the big issue because everyone gets excited because it hasn't yet been done. And that's the interesting one about spent fuel disposal, is that because spent fuel decays over time, it's cheaper to dispose of spent fuel next year than this year because the decay heat is less.
Oh, I see.
And the fund you put aside gets worth more. So the economic model says, I put my spent fuel in a cask. It's sitting on my slab somewhere. It's costing nothing to
let me just understand it from this point of view. If we extend Koeberg, I mean, and those stations can go to 60 years, I think is the max.
Yep.
After that, it's...
No, it's not the max. It's just the next number.
It's the next number. Okay, I've seen studies in France claiming they can go up to 80 years for some stations.
No,
okay, but
the Americans have some American utilities have already applied to go to 80 years.
Yeah, so it's technically possible another 40 years out of Koeberg, Yeah. And your argument is the longer we extend it, actually the cheaper the spent fuel and the waste become.
Well, no. Spent fuel different to waste. Spent fuel is, just think about it a second. I'm at Valputs. I put my cask on a slab at Valputs. It's got my fuel inside it, right?
Yeah.
Because of now, when you build a repository, the amount you can pack in a repository is a function of the heat generation the repository can take. Okay? So the less heat it generates, the denser you can pack it, the cheaper it is to dispose of.
Yeah.
Every year that passes, two things happen. The money you put in the piggy bank to dispose of the fuel gets worth more because of compound interest. And the cost of disposing it gets less.
So it's better. Okay, so the extension.
So every year you would say, I'll review it every 10 years. Every 10 years you'll come along and say, do we need to remove it? And I say, no, it's still sitting there on a concrete slab in the Karoo. It's not corroding. We have got more money in the piggy bank than we had 10 years ago, and yet the cost of disposal is less.
So you're making a profit of it just by doing nothing.
So it's essentially that there is no point until the cask physically needs replacing.
Right.
Really? Now a concrete
Yeah.
The Romans managed to build concrete that's been sound for the last 2,000 years.
Correct. Wasn't really concrete, but yes.
Well, it was a concrete mixture of sorts, and I'm sure
Solana mix. Yeah, sorry, I'm a civil engineer. I have to be precise on that again.
A geocomposite. What's it called? It's called a geo something.
No, it's not a. No, you're thinking of a geopolymer. No,
geopolymer.
The Egyptians used geopolymers. The Romans used pozzolana, which is volcanic ash. It's not, but it's
not.
It works like concrete.
Here you go. All I'm saying is that if you tell me to build a concrete-like object which will last you 1,000 years, it's been done by someone in Rome and someone in pyramids. So excuse me.
And by the way, on that geopolymer thing, it's probably the best. I attended a conference here in France on it. It's probably the best material for nuclear decommissioning because on a nano level, there's the permeability is very little. So
your concrete has to stay wet basically to stay together.
Yeah, well, the wetness is to make the crystal grow and make it thicker and make it stronger. Right?
No, but if you dry out a piece of concrete, it becomes an ash.
Yes, if you Yeah, your concrete, at 28 days, you get your strength, and then you need to keep it wet to keep the hydration process going. So the longer you keep it wet, the better. That's the idea of it.
But if you overheat a piece of concrete,
it cracks.
then what happens to it is you dry it, all the water is driven out of the structure and it crumbles to death.
Yeah. So another question here on fault pits, by the way.
We're putting into engineering here.
We're getting very complicated. Another question here on fault pits, and I'm going to put the question on the screen. As far as I know, fault pits is for lower level waste, and waste is spelled wrong there.
My waste is very much a lower level activity. No, look, Valputs is currently licensed for items with essentially primarily limited to a half-life of 30 years.
Okay. With
the concept that it's sort of given a 300-year proof of concept. So yes, it is not licensed for spent fuel. At the moment, my view would be that we could put the spent fuel casks from Coburg up there as an interim store, not as a final disposal. But what is true is that we'll have to in South Africa at some point find a low level, a deep repository for either the high level waste from reprocessing, if we ever did that, or more likely just the fuel being disposed of. And our geological structures are pretty good for that. And in fact, we have driven, I think, 4 deep boreholes at Valputs, which have shown that the rock which Valputs is over has, I think that's a kilometer of unfractured rock beneath it. So it looks like it's good enough to actually do the final repository, but it's not licensed for it. What is more interesting is that the companies digging the holes in France for the French repository, I understand, as Africans. Yeah,
CGO is the project called, and I worked on the design of it as well.
But it's also getting involved. Shouldn't allow this.
Well, you know what's interesting? I had meetings with France's EDF, and I spoke Afrikaans in some of them. So, there are a few of them over here.
Oh no, we've trained a few guys in the world, but yes, we're getting carried away.
Yeah,
but I mean, Valputs is not.
On the final minutes, we really got over time now. On the pebble bed, all right? Yeah. I've had some questions on that as well. Do you think it's ever going to be built? And is it worthwhile looking into it again? And how should we do it? Private, government? What's your view on that?
Right. The answer is the actual design of the PBMR 400 megawatt thermal machine, as put together by us between 93 and 2010. I do not believe we should consider restarting that. It's like someone going along and saying we're going to choose a good design of motor car that was never actually built in the 1970s and try and build it now. It's not appropriate. Pebble bed reactors as a fuel type and a general technology is very well established in the world, and there is at the moment the Chinese have got a twin unit site with 250 megawatt thermal. And there's 2 reactors, 250 megawatt thermal with a steam generator attached to them, the helium, and that's going into service later this year, as I understand it. So I think pebble bed reactors in general, I believe, are very much a way to go. I think we've got a very good base in this country of understanding them. Yeah. And I think that we should be looking at those for the South African SMR, but I wouldn't try and restart the PBMR project per se, in part because the PBMR project was originally designed to be a rearrangement of German technology from the 80s to build a machine to come to market quickly. Now, that's that odd, it didn't work out that way. Whereas if you ask me now to do having learned so much through doing the PBMR project, getting to manufacturing, because we must understand PBMR was in manufacture when it was cancelled. The RPV was delivered to South Africa. 1,000-ton push was delivered to South Africa. The graphite was in Germany. It was being built. And so on and so on and so on. All these were cut up with it. I would not do it the same way now, because many of the questions we asked when we were doing PBMR was, could we rely upon the fuel to actually be reliable? Could we manufacture fuel to that standard, or should there be some fallback in case it isn't quite that good? Is it possible? And there's all many is it possibles, and almost everything we talked about have actually been achieved since then. So my view is, if I was doing if I would going forward with a PBMR type design, I'd try and go to somebody who is currently building one and get in partnership with them.
X Energy in the US is doing that, I believe.
X Energy is not building anything yet. I'm a very cynical person about moving from three-dimensional diagrams to actual physical concrete.
Yes.
And if I look even at the Chinese with theirs, they've spent several years being slowed down because they found that the design of the steam generators was really clever and really good. They just couldn't work out how to build it, and they had all kinds of problems. But so to me, if I was going to go forward today, the other one is simply is geopolitics and who you're dealing with and what they view it. And I always worry slightly with some American politicians who believe they have the right to sanction you if you aren't doing what they want you to do.
Yeah.
And so the prospect then is how that will work out. But I don't know. It depends on many things.
Okay, but it is potentially possible to restart the project, right?
No, I don't think I wouldn't restart the project in the sense of we go and do our own design. I'd use it as part of a joint venture with somebody else if I had a chance.
Okay.
Because the window that we had in the 1990s, I think, is gone.
Okay. Yeah, Dave, I think we've gone way over time, but thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion. You should come back anytime, to talk about this.
Anytime. I'm a decrepit old retired gentleman, so you can drag me.
No, I think people enjoy it. And the other thing is, I think there's a need for people to understand the nuclear energy a little bit better, because there's a lot of, you read something in a newspaper, and I just know, even structural engineers, on the face of it, it's complete nonsense, and it's because people don't think. I think nuclear needs to start engaging with the public a bit more.
Yeah, and I'll give you my favorite joke. To finish with the Dre joke, I always find it very funny when the Cape Town Council wants to reduce their carbon footprint of their energy consumption, and don't realise they've been powered by Coburg since 1984.
Okay.
Every time Cape Town Council says their aim is to reduce their carbon footprint, excuse me, they've been powered by that twin unit monster up the coast from them since 84, 85.
This belief in carbon footprints needs to, I don't know.
I wasn't trying to say right or wrong, Hugo. I was saying is when somebody is that disconnected from what they're saying. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree that, but it's like, how I put it this way, checking your carbon footprint is the modern equivalent of the 10 Commandments. And people really need to get over that. It is not, in my view, the end of the world. Like, there's ways to address it without going excessively overboard. And as you say, you end up with stupidities like that where you're trying to measure the amount of carbon dioxide in a nuclear power plant.
But that's just you lie, because World Wildlife Fund said we can't possibly dare, because our logic would tell us that France is the solution to the climate, to carbon footprint.
Well, it's interesting to see the next IPCC report in September coming out. Worldwide, you can hear leaders saying this. They've realized, they've looked at Germany, they've looked at Denmark, and they've realized, wait a minute, why are they going green? We are told it's getting cheaper and the electricity prices are the highest in the world. That's what common sense people would ask, right?
California and the USA.
California and the USA. Why is the biggest migration in America currently underway? Is one of the biggest in the history. People are leaving the coastal cities for the heartland because of high energy prices, right? People are not asking these basic questions. And then you ask yourself, why has France got this cheap electricity? So slowly but surely, people are realizing, if you're serious about decarbonization, I think Africa shouldn't care, but whatever, if we care about it, fine. Nuclear is the logical conclusion of that. And then we need to admit, all the safety aspects of nuclear. And then all those arguments about the waste and the decommissioning and stuff, in my view, it comes from complete ignorance. First know what you're talking about before you make assertions in the media.
Cool. At least we have a decommissioning fund, and we have spent fuel management. We know virtually every atom that we've used in the power stations is currently today.
Yeah.
We don't chuck it in the atmosphere and say it's up to you to find it.
Okay. Anyways, Nicholls. Dave Nicholls.
Nicholls, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave. I appreciate it.
Great. Okay, Hugo. Thanks. Whenever you want to. I'm around.
Okay.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.